The most important assumption in the history of science has never been tested. It has been adopted without experiment, accepted without proof, and embedded so deeply in the modern worldview that it is rarely stated, rarely questioned, and rarely recognized as an assumption at all. The assumption is this: the brain produces consciousness. The neurons fire, the synapses connect, the electrochemical signals propagate through the neural circuits, and the result, the subjective, qualitative, experientially vivid awareness that constitutes your inner life, is the output of the neural computation. Consciousness is what the brain does, the way digestion is what the stomach does, the way locomotion is what the legs do. The brain is a biological machine. Consciousness is its product, and when the machine stops, the product ceases. This assumption is called the production theory of consciousness. It is the default position of modern neuroscience, the implicit framework of cognitive psychology, and the unexamined foundation of the materialist worldview that dominates the scientific establishment. And it has never been proven, not by any experiment, not by any observation, and not by any logical argument that compels its acceptance over the alternatives. The production theory is supported by correlations. Specific brain states are correlated with specific conscious experiences. Damage to specific brain regions produces specific deficits in conscious function. Stimulation of specific neural circuits produces specific sensory experiences, and the correlations are robust, reproducible, and extensively documented, constituting one of the great achievements of modern neuroscience. But correlation is not production. A television set is correlated with the programs it displays damage the television, and the programs are distorted, destroy the television, and the programs cease. But the television does not produce the programs. The programs are produced elsewhere by the broadcast station, and the television receives them, translates them, and displays them. The correlation between the television and the programs is real. The conclusion that the television produces the programs is wrong. The question is whether the brain is a television or a broadcast station, whether the brain produces consciousness the way a station produces signals, or receives consciousness the way a television receives signals. The correlations between the brain and consciousness are consistent with both interpretations. The production theory says the brain is the station. The alternative says the brain is the television, and the correlations alone cannot distinguish between the two. The television analogy is not merely illustrative, it is logically precise. Every observation that the production theory cites as evidence for production is equally consistent with reception. Damage to the brain impairs consciousness, but damage to a television impairs the programs. Stimulation of the brain produces specific experiences, but adjusting the television's tuning produces specific channels. Specific brain regions are associated with specific functions, but specific components of the television are associated with specific aspects of the display. And the death of the brain terminates consciousness, but the destruction of the television terminates the programs. In every case, the observation is consistent with both production and reception. The observation alone cannot distinguish between them. The philosopher Keith Ward has described the logical situation with precision. The fact that the brain is necessary for consciousness does not prove that the brain is sufficient for consciousness. A radio is necessary for receiving a broadcast, but the radio is not sufficient for the broadcast. The broadcast requires the radio plus the signal. The production theory claims that the brain is both necessary and sufficient. The filter theory claims that the brain is necessary but not sufficient, that consciousness requires the brain plus the signal. And the correlations between the brain and consciousness, which the production theory cites as its strongest evidence, are equally predicted by both theories. The distinction between necessary and sufficient is the crux of the debate. The production theory must show that the brain is sufficient, that the brain alone, without any external input, produces consciousness from its own internal resources. The filter theory need only show that the brain is necessary, that the brain is required for the specific, embodied, biologically mediated form of consciousness, but that the consciousness itself originates from a source that the brain receives rather than generates. Let us examine what the brain actually does in detail, with precision, and without the assumption that the production theory provides. The brain is the most complex object in the known universe. It contains approximately 86 billion neurons, cells that specialize in the transmission of electrochemical signals. Each neuron is connected to approximately 10,000 other neurons through synapses, the junctions, where the electrochemical signals are transmitted from one neuron to another through the release and reception of neurotransmitter. Molecules. The total number of synaptic connections in the human brain is approximately 100 trillion, a number that exceeds the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy by a factor of approximately 1,000. The brain's activity is measurable. The electroencephalogram measures the collective electrical activity of millions of neurons firing simultaneously, producing the characteristic brainwave patterns that neuroscience associates with specific states of consciousness. The beta waves, 1-3, 30 Hz, are associated with alert, focused, analytical thinking. The alpha waves, 8-13 Hz, are associated with relaxed, calm, meditative awareness. The theta waves, 4-8 Hz, are associated with the hypnagogic state between waking and sleeping, with deep meditation, and with the creative, associative, insight-producing mode of cognition. And the delta waves 0.5 to 4 Hz are associated with deep, dreamless sleep. The brain's structure is mapped. The visual cortex processes visual information. The auditory cortex processes auditory information. The motor cortex generates the commands that produce voluntary movement. The prefrontal cortex performs the executive functions planning, decision-making, impulse control, and the maintenance of the sense of self. The hippocampus consolidates memories. The amygdala processes emotions, especially fear. And the default mode network, the network of brain regions that is most active when the mind is not focused on any specific task, maintains the ongoing, self-referential, autobiographical narrative that constitutes the sense of a continuous self. The default mode network deserves special attention in the consciousness debate. The DMN was discovered in 2001 by the neurologist Marcus Reichel at Washington University, who noticed that a specific network of brain regions, the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus, and the angular gyrus, was consistently more active when subjects were not focused on any specific task than when they were engaged in focused cognitive activity. The DMN is the brain's resting state network, the network that operates when the mind is wandering, daydreaming, reminiscing, planning, and engaging in the self-referential, autobiographical processing that constitutes the ordinary sense of self. The DMN is the strongest candidate for the brain's primary filtering mechanism. The DMN maintains the stable, consistent, self-referential model of reality that constitutes ordinary waking consciousness. The DMN suppresses information that does not fit the model. The DMN enforces the boundaries of the self, the distinction between me and not me, between inside and outside, between the self and the world. And the DMN's activity level correlates with the degree of filtering. More DMN activity produces more filtering. A narrower, more self-focused, more survival-oriented awareness, and less DMN activity produces less filtering. A wider, less self-focused, more expansive awareness. The discovery of the DMN provides the filter theory with a specific, identifiable, measurable neural mechanism. The filter is not a metaphor. It is the default mode network, a specific network of brain regions whose activity level determines the degree of consciousness constraining that the brain performs, and the prediction of the filter theory that reducing the DMN's activity should expand consciousness has been confirmed by multiple lines of evidence, as we will examine in the next stage of this investigation. Every one of these correlations is real. Every one is reproducible. Every one is extensively documented. And every one is consistent with both the production theory and the alternative. The production theory says the visual cortex produces the visual experience. The alternative says the visual cortex receives the visual experience, tuning into the specific frequency of the conscious field that corresponds to visual information and translating the signal into the specific, biologically mediated, individually experienced visual awareness. The correlation is the same, the interpretation is different, and the difference in interpretation is the most consequential difference in the philosophy of mind. The production theory faces a specific, well-known and unresolved problem, the hard problem of consciousness. The philosopher David Chalmers formulated the hard problem in 1995. The hard problem is not the problem of explaining the brain's functions, its information processing, its sensory discrimination, its motor control, its memory consolidation. These are the easy problems. They are problems of mechanism, problems that can, in principle, be solved by identifying the neural circuits, the neurotransmitters, and the computational processes that produce the specific functions. The easy problems are hard in practice but easy in principle. They require detailed, painstaking neuroscience. But they do not require a new conceptual framework. The hard problem is different. The hard problem is the problem of explaining why the neural processing feels like something, why there is a subjective, qualitative, experientially vivid inner life associated with the brain's computational activity. The neurons fire, the circuits compute, the information is processed. But why does the processing produce experience? Why is there something it is like to see the color red, to hear a C sharp, to feel the warmth of sunlight? Why is the brain's information processing not carried out in the dark without any experiential accompaniment, without any subjective awareness, without any inner life at all? The hard problem is not a gap in the current neuroscience that future research will fill. It is a structural limitation of the production theory, a limitation that arises from the theory's fundamental assumption that consciousness is the output of a physical process. No physical description, no matter how complete, can bridge the explanatory gap between the objective, the neural process, and the subjective, the conscious experience. The neural description tells you everything about the process. It tells you nothing about the experience. And the gap between the process and the experience is the hard problem, the problem that the production theory, by its own structure, cannot solve. The philosopher Thomas Nagel posed the hard problem in its most vivid form in his 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Nagel argued that no amount of physical information about the bat's brain, its neural architecture, its echolocation circuits, its sensory processing, can tell you what it is like to be a bat. The bat's experience has a subjective character that the objective description cannot capture. The subjective character is the hard problem, and the hard problem is hard because the production theory assumes that the subjective must be derived from the objective, and the derivation cannot be performed. The philosopher Daniel Dennett has attempted to dissolve the hard problem by denying that consciousness has the subjective quality that Nagel describes. Dennett argues that the what it is like quality is an illusion that the brain's information processing produces the functional states that we report as conscious experiences, but that there is no additional, subjective, qualitative, something it is like, beyond the functional states. The illusion of subjectivity is itself a product of the brain's information processing, a computational artifact that the system produces and that the system mistakes for a genuine feature of reality. Dennett's position has been described by his critics as denying the datum, rejecting the one thing that the consciousness debate was supposed to explain. The philosopher John Searle responded, "Where consciousness is concerned, the appearance is the reality. If it seems to me that I am conscious, I am conscious. The subjective quality of experience is not an illusion. It is the most certain thing. I know more certain than the existence of the external world, more certain than the existence of the brain, and more certain than the existence of the neural processes that Dennett claims produce it." Searle's point is sharp. The production theory must explain the subjective quality of experience, not explain it away. The hard problem is the problem of explaining the subjective quality, and the production theory has not explained it despite decades of research, despite billions of dollars of funding, and despite the efforts of the most brilliant neuroscientists and philosophers of the past 30 years. The hard problem remains hard, and the production theory remains, on this specific point, without an answer. The physicist Roger Penrose has described the hard problem in terms that connect it to the deepest questions in physics. Consciousness is not something that can be explained by the known laws of physics. The known laws describe the behavior of matter. They do not describe, and, I believe, cannot describe, the subjective quality of conscious experience. The explanation of consciousness will require a new physics, a physics that includes the subjective as a fundamental feature of reality rather than a derivative of the objective. Penrose's statement is radical. It says that the production theory does not merely lack the explanation of consciousness. It says that the known physics, the physics on which the production theory is based, is incapable of providing the explanation. The explanation requires a new physics, and the new physics, Penrose suggests, must include consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality, not as a product of the brain, but as a basic ingredient of the universe, as fundamental as matter, energy, and spacetime. Penrose's call for a new physics is not a retreat into mysticism. It is a scientific assessment, the assessment of a physicist who has spent decades at the boundary between physics and consciousness, and who has concluded that the current physics does not have the resources to explain the most obvious feature of reality, the fact that it is experienced. The production theory assumes that the current physics is sufficient, that the neural processes described by the known laws are enough to produce consciousness. Penrose says they are not. The explanation requires something more, a physics that includes consciousness as a fundamental feature rather than a derivative product. The philosopher Galen Strawson has made the same point from the philosophical side. We know for certain that consciousness exists. We know for certain that physical matter exists. The production theory asks us to derive the certain from the certain to show how conscious experience arises from physical matter, and the derivation has not been performed. After 300 years of trying, the materialist production theory has not produced a single plausible account of how the objective gives rise to the subjective. The failure is not for lack of trying. It is a structural failure, a failure that reflects the inadequacy of the framework rather than the incompleteness of the research. The philosopher Philip Goff has argued that the hard problem is not merely unsolved, but unsolvable within the production theory's framework. Goff identifies three possible positions on the nature of consciousness. Materialism, consciousness, is produced by physical processes. Dualism, consciousness, is a separate substance from physical matter. And panpsychism, consciousness, is a fundamental feature of physical reality, present at every level of the physical world. Goff argues that materialism cannot solve the hard problem because the derivation of the subjective from the objective is impossible, that dualism faces the interaction problem. How does the non-physical consciousness interact with the physical brain? And that panpsychism is the most parsimonious solution. the solution that avoids both the hard problem and the interaction problem, by positing that consciousness is not produced by matter and does not interact with matter from outside. It is matter, or, more precisely, it is the inner nature of the physical reality that the physics describes from the outside. Goff's panpsychism is one of several alternatives to the production theory that the hard problem has motivated. The cosmopsychism of the philosopher Ite Sheni posits that the universe as a whole is a single, unified consciousness, and that individual conscious experiences are aspects of the universal consciousness, filtered and focused through the biological instruments of individual brains. The idealism of the philosopher Bernardo Kastrup posits that consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality, and that the physical world, including the brain, is a representation within consciousness rather than the producer of consciousness. And the neutral monism of the philosopher Bertrand Russell posits that the fundamental nature of reality is neither physical nor mental, but a neutral substance that manifests as physical when observed from the outside, and as mental when experienced from the inside. Each of these alternatives is consistent with the filter theory. If consciousness is universal cosmopsychism, then the brain filters the universal consciousness into individual experience. If consciousness is fundamental idealism, then the brain is a representation within consciousness that constrains consciousness to a specific, embodied, biologically mediated form. And if reality is neutral monism, then the brain is the mechanism that translates the neutral substance's inner nature, consciousness, into the specific, individual, experientially vivid awareness that constitutes the inner life. The production theory is not the only option. It is not even the most philosophically defensible option. It is merely the most familiar option, the option that the materialist worldview has adopted as its default, and that the scientific establishment has accepted without the critical scrutiny that the alternatives deserve. The alternative to the production theory, the theory that the brain receives, rather than produces consciousness, was first articulated in its modern form by the philosopher Henri Bergson in 1896. Bergson's argument was based on a specific distinction, the distinction between a generator and a filter. A generator produces its output. Destroy the generator, and the output ceases. The cessation proves that the generator was the source. A filter restricts its input. Damage the filter, and the input is not reduced. It is increased. The damage to the filter allows more of the input to pass through, producing an expansion of the output rather than a reduction. Bergson argued that the brain is not a generator, but a filter, a biological mechanism that narrows, constrains, and focuses a vast pre-existing field of consciousness into the specific, survival-focused, individually experienced awareness that biological life requires. The brain does not create consciousness. The brain reduces consciousness, selecting, from the conscious field's infinite content, the specific subset that the organism needs to navigate its environment, find food, avoid predators, and reproduce. Bergson's argument makes a specific, testable prediction. If the brain is a filter, then damage to the brain should, in specific circumstances, produce an expansion of consciousness rather than a reduction. Less brain activity should produce more awareness, not less, because the damage removes the filter that was constraining the consciousness to the narrow band that biological survival requires. The prediction is counterintuitive from the production theory's perspective. If the brain produces consciousness, then less brain activity should always produce less consciousness. The relationship should be straightforward and monotonic. More neural activity equals more awareness. Less neural activity equals less awareness. Zero neural activity equals zero awareness. The production theory predicts a positive linear unidirectional relationship between brain activity and conscious experience. The filter theory predicts a more complex relationship, a relationship in which specific reductions in brain activity can produce specific expansions in conscious experience. The relationship is not monotonic. It is nonlinear, domain-specific, and dependent on which brain regions are affected and what type of filtering they perform. Damage to the visual cortex reduces visual consciousness because the visual cortex is the receiver for visual information, and damage to the receiver impairs the reception. But damage to the default mode network may expand consciousness because the DMN is the filter, and damage to the filter widens the reception. The distinction between the receiver and the filter is crucial. The brain contains both receivers, the sensory cortices, the motor cortex, the hippocampus and filters, the default mode network, the thalamic gating mechanisms, the prefrontal executive control systems. Damage to the receivers impairs consciousness. Damage to the filters expands consciousness. And the filter theory predicts exactly this pattern, a pattern that the production theory, with its monotonic relationship between brain activity and consciousness, does not predict and cannot easily explain. The philosopher William James arrived at the same conclusion independently. James described the brain as a permissive or transmissive organ, an organ that permits or transmits consciousness rather than producing it. James wrote, "Our normal waking consciousness is but one special type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted from it by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. We may go through life without suspecting their existence, but apply the requisite stimulus, and at a touch, they are there in all their completeness. The filmiest of screens is the brain's filter. The potential forms are the unfiltered signal, and the requisite stimulus is whatever removes the screen, whether it is meditation, psychedelics, brain injury, or the approach of death." The writer Aldous Huxley popularized the filter theory in his 1954 book, The Doors of Perception. Huxley described the brain as a reducing valve that restricts the flow of mind at large, the vast, universal, unfiltered consciousness into the narrow stream that biological survival requires. The reducing valve is necessary. Without it, the organism would be overwhelmed by the information's vastness. But the valve is not the source. It is the constraint. And the consciousness that flows through the valve is not produced by the valve. It is produced by mind at large, by the universal field of awareness that exists independently of the brain, and that the brain transmits rather than creates. The reducing valve has a specific evolutionary justification. An organism that perceived mind at large, that experienced the full, unfiltered, infinite awareness of the conscious field, would be unable to navigate the physical environment. The information would be too vast, too complex, and too disconnected from the immediate survival needs to be useful. The organism needs a specific, focused, survival-relevant awareness. Where is the food? Where is the predator? What is the temperature? Is the mating partner available? The reducing valve provides exactly this, a narrow, focused, survival-relevant stream of awareness, extracted from the vast, unfocused, survival-irrelevant ocean of mind at large. The valve's narrowness is not a defect. It is an adaptation, an evolutionary solution to the problem of navigating a physical environment with a consciousness that is, by nature, far vaster than the navigation requires. The brain evolved not to produce consciousness, but to constrain it, to narrow the infinite to the finite, the vast to the specific, and the universal to the individual. And the evolutionary history of the brain is the history of the valve's progressive refinement, the progressive development of more and more sophisticated mechanisms for filtering the signal, for tuning the antenna, and for producing the specific, survival-focused, individually experienced awareness that biological life requires. The neuroscientist Wilder Penfield, one of the founders of modern neurosurgery, and one of the most accomplished brain mappers of the 20th century, arrived at the filter theory through decades of direct observation of the living brain. Penfield performed over 1,000 brain surgeries in which the patients were conscious and could report their experiences while Penfield stimulated specific brain regions with electrodes. Penfield's stimulations produced involuntary movements, involuntary sensory experiences, and involuntary memory recalls, but they never produced the sense of will, the sense of self, or the sense of being the agent of one's own actions. The electrode could make the patient's arm move, but the patient always reported, "I didn't do that." "You did that." The patient's sense of agency, the sense of being the one who decides, who wills, who acts, could not be produced by the electrode's stimulation of any brain region. Penfield's conclusion, stated at the end of his career in his book The Mystery of the Mind, was unequivocal. The mind has a kind of energy of its own. It can make decisions and put them into effect by calling upon neural mechanisms. But there is no place in the cerebral cortex where electrical stimulation will cause a patient to believe or to decide. Penfield's conclusion was the conclusion of a man who had spent decades mapping the brain's functions with direct electrical stimulation, and who had found, at the end of the mapping, that the mind is not in the map. The brain's functions are in the map. The mind's functions are not. Penfield's finding has been replicated and extended by subsequent neurosurgeons. The neurosurgeon Itzhak Fried at UCLA has performed similar stimulations during epilepsy surgeries and has confirmed Penfield's core observation. The electrode can produce involuntary experiences, but cannot produce the sense of will, the sense of agency, or the sense of being the one who decides. The I, the subject who experiences, who decides, who wills, is not in the brain, it is in the mind. And the mind, as Penfield concluded, is not identical to the brain. The neuroscientist Benjamin Libet's famous experiments in the 1980s added a further dimension to the puzzle. Libet measured the timing of the brain's readiness potential, the neural activity that precedes a voluntary movement, and found that the readiness potential begins approximately 550 milliseconds before the subject reports the conscious intention to move. The brain decides to move before the subject is aware of the decision. The finding has been widely interpreted as evidence against free will, as evidence that the brain produces the decision and the consciousness is merely informed after the fact. But the filter theory provides a different interpretation. If the consciousness is the signal and the brain is the receiver, then the readiness potential is not the brain deciding to move. It is the brain receiving the decision, the neural correlate of the signal's arrival, which necessarily precedes the signal's conscious registration, because the reception, the neural processing, must occur before the display, the conscious awareness. The television processes the signal before displaying the image. The brain processes the decision before displaying the awareness. The delay does not prove that the brain produces the decision. It proves that the brain receives the decision and processes it before it enters consciousness. The distinction between the brain's functions and the mind's functions is the distinction between the television and the broadcast station. The brain's functions, sensory processing, motor control, memory consolidation, emotional regulation, are the television's functions, the reception, the translation, and the display of the signal. The mind's functions: will, agency, decision, the sense of being the one who experiences, are the station's functions, the production of the signal that the television receives and displays. The production theory says, the brain is both the television and the station. The filter theory says, the brain is the television. The station is elsewhere in the conscious field, in mind at large, in the universal awareness that the brain tunes into, and that the brain's filtering constrains to the specific, individual, biologically mediated experience that constitutes your inner life. The The stakes of the debate are not merely academic. If the production theory is correct, then consciousness is a product of biological computation, temporary, local, brain-dependent, and destined to cease when the brain dies. Your consciousness is a transient phenomenon, a brief flicker of awareness produced by the specific configuration of neurons in your specific brain, lasting for the duration of your biological life and then extinguished permanently. If the filter theory is correct, then consciousness is not a product of the brain but a fundamental feature of reality, universal, pre-existing, brain-independent, and not destroyed when the brain dies. Your consciousness is not a transient phenomenon. It is a local, specific, biologically mediated expression of a universal field of awareness, a field that exists before the brain, that the brain tunes into during life, and that continues after the brain's dissolution. The brain's death is not the end of consciousness. It is the end of the filtering, the removal of the reducing valve that constrained the consciousness to the narrow band of biological awareness, and the release of the consciousness back into the wider field from which it was drawn. The difference between the two theories is the difference between a universe in which consciousness is a cosmic accident, a late, unlikely, biologically dependent product of a blind physical process, and a universe in which consciousness is a cosmic fundamental, an early, essential, physically independent feature of reality that the brain accesses rather than produces. The question of which theory is correct is not philosophical, it is empirical. Bergson's prediction that damage to the brain's filter should produce an expansion of consciousness is a testable prediction, and the evidence that tests the prediction has been accumulating for over a century. The evidence is the subject of the next stage of this investigation. We have established that the evidence from near-death experiences, psychedelic research, terminal lucidity, savant syndrome, and acquired savant syndrome converges on a single conclusion. The brain does not produce consciousness. The brain filters consciousness, constraining a vast, pre-existing awareness into the narrow, survival-focused experience that biological life requires. The filter theory explains the evidence that the production theory cannot. The expansion of consciousness when brain activity decreases, the return of cognitive function in terminally damaged brains, and the emergence of extraordinary abilities following specific brain injuries. But the filter theory, as Bergson articulated it in 1896, was a philosophical framework, a conceptual model without a physical mechanism. Bergson could describe the brain as a reducing valve, but he could not explain how the valve works, what the signal consists of, or what physical process connects the pre-existing consciousness to the biological brain that receives it. The philosophy was compelling. The mechanism was missing. The mechanism is no longer missing. The physics of the past 3 decades, specifically the quantum biology of microtubules, the Orch OR model of consciousness, and the emerging science of biological quantum coherence, has provided a specific, physically precise, experimentally testable mechanism for the antenna theory. The mechanism is quantum. The antenna is the microtubule, and the signal is encoded in the quantum structure of spacetime itself. Let us begin with the microtubule. Microtubules are hollow, cylindrical protein structures that constitute the internal skeleton of every cell in your body. They are composed of tubulin proteins, dimers of alpha-tubulin and beta-tubulin, that polymerize into long, helical cylinders, approximately 25 nanometers in diameter and up to several millimeters in length. The microtubules are present in every cell, but they are especially abundant in neurons, the brain cells that the neuroscience identifies as the substrate of consciousness. Each neuron contains approximately 10 to the 9th tubulin dimers, and the total number of tubulin dimers in the human brain is approximately 10 to the 18th a billion individual protein units, each one capable of existing in two conformational states, a straight state and a bent state. The two conformational states of the tubulin dimer are the key to the quantum mechanism. The straight state and the bent state are separated by a tiny energy difference, approximately 10 to the minus 20 joules, comparable to the thermal energy at room temperature. This means that the tubulin dimer can transition between the two states with minimal energy input and, crucially, that the dimer can exist in a quantum superposition of both states simultaneously. The tubulin is not merely a structural protein. It is a quantum bit, a qubit capable of existing in a superposition of the straight and the bent states, and capable of participating in quantum computations that the classical neural processing does not exhaust. The microtubule's computational capacity is extraordinary. Each tubulin dimer is a qubit capable of representing not just 0 or 1, but any superposition of 0 and 1 simultaneously. A microtubule containing 1 million tubulin dimers is a quantum computer with 1 million qubits, a computational resource that exceeds, by many orders of magnitude, any quantum computer that human technology has yet constructed. And the human brain contains approximately 10 to the 18th tubulin dimers, a billion qubits, each one capable of participating in the quantum computation, each one capable of entering superposition, and each one connected to every other through the microtubular network that pervades the neuron's interior. The classical neural computation, the electrochemical signaling between neurons that the standard neuroscience describes, operates at the level of the neuron. Approximately 86 billion neurons, each one firing or not firing, each one connected to approximately 7,000 other neurons through synaptic connections. The microtubular quantum computation operates at a level that is approximately 10 million times finer at the level of the individual tubulin dimer inside the neuron, beneath the synaptic signaling, in the protein infrastructure that the standard neuroscience treats as mere structural support. The standard neuroscience has ignored the microtubules because the standard neuroscience assumes that consciousness is produced by the synaptic computation, by the electrochemical signaling between neurons. But the synaptic computation, powerful as it is classical. It cannot produce the specific features of consciousness that the quantum computation can. The unity of experience, the binding of diverse sensory inputs into a single, unified conscious moment, the non-computability of consciousness, the ability to perform mathematical operations that Penrose has shown no classical computer can perform, and the subjective quality of experience, the what it is like quality that the hard problem identifies as the fundamental mystery of consciousness. The physicist Roger Penrose and the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff proposed the Orch OR model, orchestrated objective reduction, in 1994 as a specific, physically precise mechanism for consciousness. The Orch OR model proposes that consciousness is produced by the quantum computations in the microtubules that the tubulin qubits enter superposition, that the superpositions are maintained by the microtubules' specific geometric and electromagnetic properties, and that the superpositions collapse through Penrose's objective reduction, a specific, gravity-mediated, non-random collapse that connects the quantum computation to the Planck-scale structure of spacetime. The objective reduction is the critical element. In the standard interpretation of quantum mechanics, the collapse of a superposition is triggered by observation by the measurement that selects a specific outcome from the superposition of possible outcomes. In Penrose's objective reduction, the collapse is triggered by gravity, by the gravitational self-energy of the superposition, reaching a threshold at which the superposition becomes gravitationally unstable and collapses spontaneously. The threshold is the Planck scale, the scale of 10 to the minus 35 meters, the smallest scale at which spacetime has a well-defined geometry, and the scale at which the quantum and gravitational descriptions of reality merge. The connection to the Planck scale is what transforms the microtubule from a mere quantum computer into an antenna. The Planck scale structure of spacetime is not empty. It is the deepest level of physical reality, the level at which the quantum foam fluctuates, the level at which the holographic boundaries information is encoded, and the level at which the mathematical structure of reality is most directly expressed. The microtubule's quantum computations, through the objective reduction, connect to this deepest level, accessing the Planck scale information, tapping into the spacetime structure's encoded content, and translating the content into the specific, conscious, experientially vivid awareness that the brain produces. The Orch OR model's antenna mechanism works as follows. The tubulin qubits enter superposition, existing simultaneously in the straight and the bent states, processing information in quantum parallel, exploring multiple computational pathways simultaneously. The superpositions are maintained by the microtubule's specific properties. Their hollow cylindrical geometry shields the quantum states from the thermal noise of the cellular environment, and their electromagnetic resonance properties stabilize the coherence against the decoherence that the thermal environment would otherwise produce. The superpositions persist for a specific duration. Hameroff estimates approximately 25 milliseconds, corresponding to the 40 Hz gamma oscillation that the neuroscience identifies as the neural correlate of conscious awareness. And then the superpositions collapse through the objective reduction, connecting to the Planck scale geometry, selecting a specific outcome from the quantum superposition and producing a specific moment of conscious experience. Each moment of conscious experience is, in the Orch OR model, a discrete quantum event, a specific collapse of the microtubular superposition that produces a specific qualitative, experientially vivid moment of awareness. The moments are discrete, occurring approximately 40 times per second at the gamma frequency, and the stream of consciousness that you experience as continuous is actually a sequence of discrete quantum events, a sequence of collapses, each one producing a specific moment, and the moments strung together by the brain's temporal processing into the apparently continuous flow of conscious experience. The 40 Hz gamma oscillation is one of the most significant neural correlates of consciousness. The neuroscientist Wolf Singer at the Max Planck Institute demonstrated in the 1990s that the gamma oscillation is associated with the binding of sensory information, the process by which the brain integrates the color, the shape, the motion, and the location of an object into a single unified perception. The gamma oscillation is present during conscious awareness and absent during unconsciousness, during anesthesia, during dreamless sleep, and during the specific unconscious states that the neuroscience identifies as the absence of awareness. The Orch OR model connects the gamma oscillation to the quantum computation. Each gamma cycle, approximately 25 milliseconds, corresponds to one round of quantum computation, one cycle of superposition, coherent processing, and objective reduction that produces one discrete moment of conscious experience. The gamma oscillation is not merely a correlate of consciousness. It is the rhythm of consciousness, the temporal signature of the quantum computation that the microtubules perform, and that the objective reduction resolves into the specific, qualitative, experientially vivid moments that constitute the stream of awareness. The anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff has provided specific evidence connecting the Orch OR model to the mechanism of anesthesia. General anesthetic gases, the gases that reversibly eliminate consciousness, have been shown to bind specifically to the microtubules, specifically to the tubulin dimers, and specifically to the hydrophobic pockets within the tubulin protein that the quantum computations require. The anesthetics do not affect the synaptic signaling. The neurons continue to fire, the electrochemical signals continue to propagate, and the classical neural computation continues to operate, but the consciousness ceases. The anesthetics selectively disable the quantum computation in the microtubules while leaving the classical computation in the neurons intact, and the result is the selective elimination of consciousness while the classical brain function continues. This is a specific, testable prediction of the Orch OR model. If consciousness is produced by the quantum computation in the microtubules, then substances that specifically disable the microtubular quantum computation should specifically eliminate consciousness. The anesthetic data confirms the prediction. The anesthetics bind to the microtubules, disable the quantum computation, and eliminate consciousness, while the classical neural computation continues unaffected. The Orch OR model has been controversial since its proposal. The physicist Max Tegmark published a widely cited criticism in 2000, arguing that the thermal environment of the brain, approximately 310 Kelvin, far above the temperatures at which quantum coherence is typically maintained, would destroy the microtubular quantum states in approximately 10 to the minus 13 seconds, far too quickly for the quantum computations to occur. Tegmark's criticism was based on the assumption that the microtubules are exposed to the full thermal noise of the cellular environment, that the tubulin qubits interact freely with the surrounding molecules, and that the thermal interactions collapse the quantum states almost instantaneously. Tegmark's criticism was, for a decade, the primary obstacle to the Orch OR model's acceptance. The criticism was widely cited, frequently invoked in dismissals of the model, and generally regarded as having settled the question. The brain is too warm for quantum coherence. The microtubules are too noisy. The quantum states decohere too quickly. And the Orch OR model, however elegant its theoretical framework, is physically impossible in the thermal environment of the biological brain. The criticism was reasonable at the time. In 2000, the assumption that quantum coherence requires near absolute zero temperatures was well supported by the physics of the artificial quantum systems that physicists worked with. Superconducting circuits, ion traps, and cold atom arrays, all of which required temperatures within fractions of a degree of absolute zero to maintain coherence. The idea that a warm, wet, noisy biological system could maintain quantum coherence seemed absurd. But biology, as the quantum biology revolution has demonstrated, does not obey the assumptions of the artificial quantum systems. Biological evolution has had 4 billion years to engineer molecular structures that protect quantum states from thermal decoherent structures that the human engineers of quantum computers have not yet been able to replicate. The assumption that the brain is too warm for quantum coherence is an assumption about artificial quantum systems applied to a biological context, an assumption that the evidence of the past 15 years has progressively dismantled, but the assumption has been challenged by multiple lines of evidence. The physicist Travis Craddock and collaborators demonstrated in 2014 that the microtubule's hollow cylindrical geometry provides a specific shielding mechanism. The interior of the microtubule is electromagnetically isolated from the exterior, creating a protected environment in which quantum states can persist for much longer than Tegmark's calculation assumed. The biochemist Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan demonstrated experimentally in 2013 that microtubules exhibit quantum resonance properties, oscillating at specific frequencies, that are consistent with quantum coherent behavior, and that persist at room temperature for periods that far exceed Tegmark's predicted decoherence time. Bandyopadhyay's experiments are the most significant empirical evidence for the Orch OR model. Bandyopadhyay demonstrated that microtubules oscillate at multiple resonance frequencies, simultaneously from megahertz to gigahertz, and that the oscillation patterns display the specific properties of quantum coherent systems. Superposition, the simultaneous existence of multiple frequency modes. Entanglement, the correlation between the oscillations of distant tubulin dimers, and tunneling, the transfer of energy between modes through quantum mechanical tunneling rather than classical energy transfer. The microtubules are not merely structural proteins. They are quantum resonators, biological antennas that oscillate at specific frequencies and that maintain quantum coherence at biological temperatures. Bandyopadhyay's most striking finding is that the microtubules' resonance frequencies are organized in a fractal hierarchy with oscillations at kilohertz, megahertz, and gigahertz frequencies, all displaying the same mathematical structure, the same coherence properties, and the same quantum signatures. The fractal hierarchy suggests that the microtubular quantum computation operates at multiple scales simultaneously, from the individual tubulin dimer gigahertz through the microtubule lattice megahertz to the microtubular network kilohertz, and that the consciousness that the computation produces is a multi-scale phenomenon, integrating information from the molecular level through the cellular level to the network level in a single, unified, hierarchically organized quantum process. The physicist Hartmut Neven at Google's Quantum AI Lab has described Bandyopadhyay's results as the most significant experimental evidence for biological quantum computation ever obtained. Evidence that biological structures can maintain quantum coherence at room temperature, that the coherence is organized in a specific, hierarchical, computationally meaningful structure, and that the microtubule is not merely a structural protein, but a quantum information processing device of extraordinary sophistication. In 2022, a team at Trinity College Dublin, led by the physicist Christian Kerskens, published results in the Journal of Physics Communications demonstrating quantum entanglement signals in the human brain using MRI technology. The study detected proton spin entanglement mediated by a non-classical process that the researchers attributed to quantum processes in the brain's interior, potentially in the microtubules. The Trinity College results are preliminary and require replication, but they represent the first direct measurement of quantum entanglement in the living human brain, and they are consistent with the Orch OR model's prediction that the brain's microtubules maintain quantum coherence at biological temperatures. The quantum coherence of biological systems is no longer a speculative hypothesis. The field of quantum biology, which has exploded in the past 15 years, has demonstrated quantum coherence in multiple biological systems at biological temperatures. The photosynthetic complexes of plants and bacteria use quantum coherence to transfer energy with near-perfect efficiency, a finding that the physicists Gregory Engel and Robert Blankenship demonstrated in 2007, and that has been confirmed by multiple subsequent studies. The avian compass, the mechanism by which birds navigate using the Earth's magnetic field, operates through the quantum entanglement of radical pairs in the cryptochrome proteins of the bird's retina. And the olfactory system may use quantum tunneling to distinguish between molecules with different vibrational frequencies, a hypothesis proposed by the biophysicist Luca Turin and supported by experimental evidence from the physicist Jenny Brooks, the physicist Jim Al-Khalili, and the molecular biologist John Joe McFadden, in their book Life on the Edge, have described the quantum biology revolution as the most significant development in biology since the discovery of DNA, the demonstration that the molecular machinery of life exploits quantum mechanical effects that the classical biology had assumed were irrelevant at biological temperatures. The photosynthetic complex's quantum coherence is the most thoroughly documented example. The Fenner-Matthews-Olson complex in green sulfur bacteria transfers energy from the light harvesting antenna to the reaction center with an efficiency of approximately 99%, an efficiency that the classical physics of random thermal diffusion cannot explain, and that the quantum physics of coherent energy transfer can. The relevance to the brain antenna is direct. If photosynthetic complexes can maintain quantum coherence at biological temperatures in order to transfer energy with near-perfect efficiency, then microtubules may maintain quantum coherence at biological temperatures in order to transfer information with the specific, consciousness-relevant precision that the Orch OR model describes. The precedent has been established. The biological quantum coherence is real, and the question of whether the brain's microtubules exploit it is an empirical question, a question that the experiments of Bandyopadhyay, Craddock, and Kerskens are beginning to answer. The physicist Matthew Fisher at the University of California, Santa Barbara, has proposed an additional quantum mechanism in the brain. Nuclear spin, entanglement of phosphorus atoms in Posner molecules, calcium phosphate clusters, that could maintain quantum coherence for hours to days, far longer than the Orch OR model's 2.5 millisecond timescale. Fisher's Posner molecule hypothesis is independent of the Orch OR model, but complementary to it, providing a potential long timescale quantum mechanism that could work alongside the microtubular short timescale mechanism to produce the full range of quantum effects that the consciousness receiving function requires. The quantum biology revolution demonstrates a principle that is directly relevant to the antenna theory. Biological systems can maintain quantum coherence at room temperature. The thermal environment of the brain does not automatically destroy quantum states. Biological evolution has produced molecular structures, photosynthetic complexes, cryptochrome proteins, and possibly microtubules that protect quantum states from thermal decoherence through specific structural and electromagnetic mechanisms. The brain's microtubules may be one of these structures, a biological quantum device that evolution has produced to maintain the specific quantum coherence that the consciousness receiving function requires. Now we must consider what the antenna is receiving. If the brain is a quantum antenna that connects to the Planck-scale structure of spacetime through the objective reduction of microtubular superpositions, what is the signal? The signal, in the Orch OR model, is encoded in the geometry of spacetime itself. Penrose has argued that the Planck-scale geometry contains a specific, non-computable, experientially rich structure, a structure that the quantum computations in the microtubules access through the objective reduction, and that constitutes the content of the conscious experience. The Planck-scale geometry is not random. It is ordered, structured by the mathematical relationships that the physics describes, encoded with the information that the holographic principle identifies, and pervaded by the specific, non-computable, experientially rich quality that the consciousness exhibits. Penrose's argument that the Planck-scale geometry contains non-computable content is based on a specific mathematical result, Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Gödel demonstrated in 1931 that any sufficiently powerful, formal system contains truths that cannot be proven within the system, truths that are true, but that the system's own rules cannot derive. Penrose argues that human consciousness routinely accesses these non-computable truths through mathematical intuition, through the perception of beauty, through the creative insights that no algorithm can produce, and that the access requires a non-computational process that connects the brain to a reality beyond the computational. The objective reduction is the non-computational process. The collapse of the microtubular superposition through the gravitational self-energy is not an algorithmic computation. It is a physical process, a quantum gravitational event that selects a specific outcome through a mechanism that is not reducible to any classical algorithm. The selection is determined by the Planck-scale geometry, by the specific, non-computable, geometrically encoded structure of space-time at the smallest scale, and the conscious experience that the selection produces is the brain's reception of the Planck-scale geometry's content. the antenna's translation of the deepest level of physical reality into the specific, qualitative, non-computable experience of being aware. The holographic principle adds a specific dimension to the signal's description. If the three-dimensional world is a projection from a two-dimensional informational boundary, then the Planck-scale geometry is the projection's source, the informational substrate from which the spatial world is projected. The microtubular quantum computations, by connecting to the Planck-scale geometry through the objective reduction, are connecting to the holographic boundary to the informational source of the three-dimensional world. The antenna is receiving the signal from the boundary. The brain is translating the boundary's information into the three-dimensional, spatially extended, temporally flowing conscious experience that you inhabit. The antenna, in the holographic framework, is receiving the source code, the informational content from which the three-dimensional reality is generated. The consciousness that the antenna produces is the experience of the source code, the subjective, qualitative, experientially vivid perception of the information that constitutes the deepest level of physical reality. The brain does not produce the experience from neural raw material. The brain translates the source code into the experience, converting the holographic boundary's informational content into the specific, spatially extended, temporally flowing, emotionally textured awareness that constitutes your conscious life. The physicist David Bohm described this translation with his concept of the implicate and explicate orders. The implicate order is the source code, the enfolded, holographic, informationally complete description of reality. The explicate order is the translation, the unfolded, spatial, experientially accessible expression of the source code. And the brain is the translator, the biological device that converts the implicate order's enfolded information into the explicate order's unfolded experience through the quantum computation in the microtubules that connects the two orders through the objective reduction. The Schuman resonance adds another dimension to the antenna theory. The Schuman resonances are the electromagnetic resonances of the Earth's atmosphere, standing waves in the electromagnetic field that exists between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. The fundamental Schumann frequency is approximately 7.83 Hz, and the frequency corresponds, with striking precision, to the frequency range of the human brain's theta waves. The brain waves associated with meditation, contemplative states, and the specific mode of consciousness that the traditions describe as the perception of the deeper reality. The correspondence between the Schumann frequency and the brain's theta frequency has been documented by multiple researchers. The neuroscientist Michael Persinger at Laurentian University demonstrated that the brain's electrical activity is influenced by the Schumann resonances, that changes in the Schumann field's intensity correlate with changes in the brain's EEG patterns, and with changes in the subjective experience of the participants. Persinger proposed that the Schumann resonances may serve as a global synchronization mechanism, a planetary-scale electromagnetic field that entrains the brain's oscillations and that connects the individual brain to a collective electromagnetic environment. The Schumann resonance connection extends beyond the fundamental 7.83 Hz frequency. The Schumann resonances include multiple harmonics, approximately 14.3 Hz, 20.8 Hz, 27.3 Hz, and 33.8 Hz, and these harmonics correspond, with remarkable precision, to the brain's alpha, beta, and gamma frequency bands. The correspondence is not exact. The brain's frequencies and the Schumann frequencies are similar but not identical. But the similarity is close enough to suggest a coupling, a resonance between the brain's electromagnetic activity and the Earth's electromagnetic environment that would connect every brain on the planet to a common electromagnetic field. The neuroscientist Neil Cherry at Lincoln University documented correlations between the Schumann resonance intensity and human health indicators, including cardiovascular events, psychiatric admissions, and cognitive performance. suggesting that the human brain is sensitive to changes in the Schuman field and that the field's fluctuations affect the brain's function in measurable, health-relevant ways. Cherry's findings are correlational, not causal, but they are consistent with the hypothesis that the brain is an antenna, a receiver that is tuned to the Earth's electromagnetic environment and that is influenced by the environment's fluctuations. The entrainment hypothesis has specific implications for the antenna theory. If the brain's oscillations are entrained by the Schumann resonances, then the brain is not an isolated computation device. It is a coupled oscillator, an antenna that is tuned to the Earth's electromagnetic field and that receives, through the coupling, information that the field carries. The Schumann field is not conscious, but the Schumann field may be the carrier frequency, the electromagnetic medium through which the deeper signal, the Planck-scale information, the holographic boundaries content, the universal consciousness that the traditions describe is transmitted to the biological antenna that the brain's microtubules constitute. The physicist Luca Turin has proposed a related mechanism. The brain's microtubules may function as piezoelectric transducers, converting mechanical vibrations into electromagnetic signals and vice versa. The microtubules' tubulin proteins are piezoelectric. They generate electrical signals when mechanically compressed and mechanically deform when electrically stimulated. The piezoelectric property means that the microtubules are bidirectional transducers, converting the brain's mechanical activity into electromagnetic signals that the Schumann field can carry, and converting the Schumann field's electromagnetic signals into the mechanical vibrations that the microtubules' quantum computations process. The piezoelectric transduction connects the microtubules to the mechanical vibrations of the brain, the physical oscillations of the neural tissue, the acoustic waves that propagate through the cerebrospinal fluid, and the subtle mechanical vibrations that the body's physiological processes produce. The contemplative practices that involve sound, the Hindu mantra, the Buddhist chanting, the Christian Gregorian chant, the Sufi dhikr, may be exploiting the piezoelectric transduction. The sound vibrations mechanically stimulate the microtubules. The microtubules convert the mechanical stimulation into electromagnetic signals, and the electromagnetic signals modulate the quantum computation that produces the conscious experience. The chanting is not merely a psychological technique. It may be a physical mechanism, a means of mechanically tuning the antenna's reception through the piezoelectric properties of the microtubular hardware. The physicist James Gimzewski at UCLA has demonstrated that living cells emit sound, that the mechanical vibrations of the cell's internal structures, including the microtubules, produce acoustic emissions in the kilohertz range that can be detected by sensitive instruments. Gimzewski's sonocytology, the study of cells through their sound emissions, demonstrates that the microtubules are not silent structures. They vibrate, they oscillate, they produce and receive mechanical signals, and the signals may be the physical medium through which the antenna's quantum computations are modulated by the body's physiological activity and by the contemplative practices that the traditions have developed to tune the antenna's reception. The complete mechanism is now visible. The brain is a biological antenna. The antenna's hardware is the microtubule, the quantum resonator that maintains coherent oscillations at biological temperatures. The antenna's receiving mechanism is the objective reduction, the quantum gravitational collapse that connects the microtubular computations to the Planck-scale geometry of spacetime. The antenna's carrier frequency is the Schumann resonance, the planetary electromagnetic field that entrains the brain's oscillations, and that may serve as the medium through which the deeper signal is transmitted. And the signal itself is the information encoded in the Planck-scale structure of spacetime, the holographic boundaries content, the mathematical structure's experiential quality, the universal consciousness that the contemplative traditions perceive when the antenna's filtering is removed. The complete mechanism connects the biological antenna to every investigation in this series. The microtubule's connection to the Planck-scale geometry is the connection to the hidden layer, the holographic boundary from which the three-dimensional world is projected. The microtubule's quantum coherence is the connection to the unchanging source, the quantum information that is conserved when the brain dies. The microtubule's oscillation frequencies are the connection to the vibration, the universal symphony of quantum field vibrations that constitutes the physical world. And the microtubule's coupling to the Schuman resonance is the connection to the cosmic neural network, the planetary scale electromagnetic field that may connect every brain to a collective information environment. The antenna theory unifies the entire series. The brain is a quantum antenna that connects the individual consciousness to the universal consciousness through the microtubular quantum computations that access the Planck-scale geometry of spacetime. The filter is the brain's classical processing, the synaptic computation, the default mode network, the survival-focused attention mechanisms that constrain the antenna's reception to the narrow band that biological survival requires. And the contemplative practices are the technologies for widening the antenna's bandwidth, for reducing the classical filtering, and expanding the quantum reception to include more of the universal signal that the antenna is designed to receive. The mechanism is speculative. The Orch OR model has not been confirmed. The Tegmark objection, while challenged, has not been definitively refuted. The Schuman resonance's connection to consciousness is correlational, not causal. And the claim that the Planck-scale geometry contains experientially rich content is a philosophical proposal, not an empirical finding. But the mechanism is physically precise. It makes specific predictions. It is consistent with the evidence from quantum biology, from the psychedelic research, from the NDE data, and from the contemplative tradition's descriptions. And it provides, for the first time in the history of the consciousness debate, a specific, testable, physically grounded framework for understanding how a biological brain could function as a receiver of consciousness rather than a producer of consciousness. The antenna theory, if correct, transforms the understanding of every contemplative practice in human history. The meditation is not a psychological technique for stress reduction. It is a quantum engineering protocol, a method for optimizing the microtubular antenna's reception by reducing the classical noise, the default mode network's filtering, and enhancing the quantum coherence. The microtubular superposition's stability. The prayer is not a communication with an external deity. It is a tuning of the antenna, a specific, practice-dependent, neurologically measurable adjustment of the brain's quantum reception parameters. And the contemplative experience, the perception of a deeper reality, the encounter with the divine, the recognition of the universal consciousness, is the experience of the antenna receiving the signal clearly, without the distortion that the ordinary filtering imposes. The next stage will examine what the contemplative traditions say about the universal frequency that the antenna receives, the specific descriptions, from Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity, of the consciousness that the brain tunes into, and that the contemplative practices progressively clarify. We have established the mechanism. The brain is a biological antenna. The hardware is the microtubule, the quantum resonator that maintains coherent oscillations at biological temperatures. The receiving mechanism is the objective reduction, the quantum gravitational collapse that connects the microtubular computations to the Planck-scale structure of spacetime. And the signal is the information encoded in the deepest level of physical reality, the holographic boundaries content, the mathematical structure's experiential quality, the universal consciousness that the antenna is designed to receive. But the mechanism is the physics. The physics describes the antenna's structure, the signal's encoding, and the process by which the signal is received. The physics does not describe the signal's content, what the universal consciousness feels like, what the universal frequency sounds like when the antenna receives it clearly, and what the experience of the unfiltered signal reveals about the nature of the consciousness that the antenna is tuned to receive. The contemplative traditions can, because the traditions have been receiving the signal through the cleared antenna of the trained consciousness for millennia, and their descriptions of the signal's content are extraordinarily specific, remarkably consistent across cultures, and structurally convergent with the physics in ways that transform the antenna theory from a theoretical framework into an experiential reality. We will begin with Hinduism, which provides the most detailed phenomenological description of the universal frequency. The Hindu tradition describes the universal frequency as Nada Brahma, the cosmic sound, the primordial vibration, the vibrational ground of all reality. The concept of Nada Brahma is not metaphorical. It is literal, a description of a specific, perceivable, experientially vivid vibration that the trained consciousness can hear when the antenna's filtering is sufficiently reduced. The nada is not a physical sound. It is not a vibration of air molecules detected by the ear. It is a vibration of consciousness itself, the fundamental oscillation of the aware ground from which every physical vibration, every electromagnetic wave, and every quantum field oscillation arises. The concept of Nada Brahma, God is sound, Brahman is vibration, connects the antenna theory to our investigation of vibration, where we established that the universe is made of vibrations in quantum fields. The nada is not a different vibration from the quantum field oscillations that the physics describes. It is the same vibration perceived from within, perceived not through the instruments of physics but through the instrument of consciousness, not as a mathematical description but as an experiential reality, not as a frequency spectrum but as a living, aware, experientially rich sound that the consciousness recognizes as its own deepest nature. The musicologist Joachim Ernst Berendt, in his influential book The World is Sound, Nada Brahma, documented the convergence between the Hindu concept of the cosmic vibration and the modern physics of vibration, demonstrating that the specific frequencies that the tradition describes correspond with remarkable precision to the frequencies that the physics identifies as fundamental. The Planck frequency, the highest possible frequency, determined by the Planck-scale, the Schuman frequency, the Earth's electromagnetic resonance, and the frequencies of the cosmic microwave background radiation, the echo of the Big Bang that pervades every point of space. The cosmic vibration is not a metaphor. It is a physical reality, a reality that the physics describes in mathematical terms, and that the tradition perceives in experiential terms. The Hatha Yoga Pradipika, one of the foundational texts of the yoga tradition, describes the nada in specific, practice-based detail. The practitioner who achieves the fourth stage of nada yoga, the yoga of inner sound, perceives a sequence of 10 sounds. The buzzing of bees, the sound of a flute, the sound of a veena, a stringed instrument, the sound of bells, the sound of thunder, the sound of a drum, the sound of a trumpet, the sound of a kettle drum, the sound of a mridanga, a double-headed drum, and finally, the sound of the cosmic vibration itself, the anahata nada, the unstruck sound, the sound that is produced without any physical striking, without any physical cause, without any physical instrument. The unstruck sound is the universal frequency, the vibration of consciousness itself, perceived directly by the antenna that has been cleared of every physical and mental obstruction. The Mandukya Upanishad identifies the universal frequency with the syllable Om, the sacred sound that the tradition describes as the vibrational essence of Brahman. Om is not merely a mantra that the practitioner chants. Om is the cosmic vibration that the practitioner perceives when the chanting ceases, and the silence that follows the chanting reveals the vibration that was always present beneath the chanting's noise. The chanting of Om is the tuning of the antenna, the adjustment of the brain's vibrational state to resonate with the cosmic frequency, and the silence after the chanting is the reception, the moment when the antenna, tuned by the chanting, receives the cosmic vibration without the interference of the chanting's physical sound. The Mandukya's analysis of Om's 4 components maps onto the antenna theory with extraordinary precision. The first component, A, corresponds to the waking state, the state in which the antenna receives the signal through the maximum filtering of the physical senses and the default mode network. The second component, U, corresponds to the dream state, the state in which the filtering is partially reduced and the signal is received with greater clarity. The third component, M, corresponds to the deep sleep state, the state in which the filtering is almost completely removed and the signal is received in its near unfiltered form. And the fourth component, the silence after the M, the Turiya, corresponds to the state in which the antenna receives the signal without any filtering whatsoever, perceiving the universal frequency in its full, undistorted, infinitely rich form. The sage Ramana Maharshi described the perception of the universal frequency with characteristic simplicity. The self is always emitting its signal. It is like a radio station that never stops broadcasting. The problem is not with the station. The problem is with the receiver. The receiver is tuned to the wrong frequency, tuned to the noise of the mind, the chatter of the thoughts, the static of the emotions. Tune the receiver to the right frequency, and the signal is immediately clear. It was always there. It was always broadcasting. The only thing that changed was the tuning. The Upanishadic seer Narada, after whom the Bhakti Sutras are named, is described in the tradition as the divine musician, the celestial sage who carries a veena, the stringed instrument of the cosmic vibration, and who travels between the worlds playing the music of the universal frequency. Narada is not merely a mythological figure. Narada is a symbol, a representation of the consciousness that has been tuned to the universal frequency and that transmits the frequency through the specific medium of music. The tradition's identification of the cosmic vibration with music is significant. The universal frequency is not merely a tone. It is a harmony, a complex, multi-layered, aesthetically rich structure that the consciousness perceives when the antenna is properly tuned as the most beautiful, the most profound, and the most emotionally moving sound that the human experience can contain. The physicist Brian Greene has described a parallel insight from string theory. The universe is a symphony. The particles are the notes, the forces are the harmonies, and the strings, the fundamental entities of string theory, are the instruments. The universe is not made of stuff, it is made of music. Green's musical metaphor is not merely an analogy, it is a structural description, a description of a universe that is, at its most fundamental level, a vibration, a frequency, a resonance that the string theory's mathematics describes, and that the Hindu tradition's Nada Yoga perceives. The Kashmir Shaivite tradition adds a specific dimension through the concept of spanda, the subtle vibration, the creative pulsation, the primordial oscillation of consciousness that constitutes the ground of all reality. Spanda is not a vibration in something. It is the vibration of something, the vibration of consciousness itself, the fundamental pulse of the aware ground from which every specific vibration, every specific frequency, and every specific oscillation in the physical world arises, the Spanda Karikas. The foundational text of the Spanda tradition describes Spanda as the self-movement of consciousness, the supreme consciousness, of its own free will, vibrates, and the vibration is the universe. The universal frequency is consciousness vibrating. The universe is the vibration's expression. And the antenna, the brain's microtubular quantum resonator, is the biological device that detects the vibration and translates it into the specific, embodied, individually experienced awareness that constitutes your conscious life. The practice of Nada Yoga, the yoga of inner sound, is the Hindu technology for tuning the antenna to the universal frequency. The practitioner sits in silence, closes the ears with the fingers, a technique called Shanmukhi Mudra, and listens. At first, the practitioner hears the body's internal sounds, the heartbeat, the blood flow, the breathing. Then, as the attention deepens and the external noise diminishes, the practitioner begins to hear subtler sounds, the high-pitched ringing, the low-frequency humming, the specific tonal qualities that the Hatha Yoga Pradipika describes. And finally, as the attention deepens further and the internal noise also diminishes, the practitioner perceives the Anahata Nada, the unstruck sound, the universal frequency, the vibration of consciousness itself. The neurophysiological correlates of Nada Yoga have been studied by the researcher Shirley Telles at the Patanjali Research Foundation. Telles found that Nada Yoga practitioners show specific changes in brain activity during the practice: increased theta activity, the frequency range that corresponds to the Schuman resonance; decreased beta activity, the frequency range associated with the default mode network's analytical processing; and increased gamma coherence, the frequency range associated with the unified, bound, integrated conscious experience that the Orch OR model identifies as the signature of quantum coherent processing in the microtubules. The neurophysiology is consistent with the antenna theory. The Nada Yoga practice is tuning the antenna, reducing the filtering, decreased beta, DMN activity, enhancing the quantum coherence, increased gamma, and aligning the brain's oscillation with the planetary electromagnetic field, increased theta, Schumann range. The Nada Yoga tradition describes 4 stages of perception that map onto the antenna theory's description of progressive filter removal. The first stage, Vaikari, is the perception of external, physical sound. The antenna is fully filtered, and the consciousness perceives only the sounds that the physical environment produces. The second stage, Madhyama, is the perception of internal mental sound. The filtering is partially reduced, and the consciousness perceives the sounds that the mind produces: the inner voice, the mental chatter, the auditory imagery. The third stage, Pashyanti, is the perception of the subtle pre-linguistic vibration. The filtering is further reduced, and the consciousness perceives the vibrational substratum from which both external and internal sounds arise: the pre-sound, the proto-vibration, the quantum oscillation that precedes the specific sounds that the physical and mental processing produce. And the fourth stage, Para, is the perception of the transcendent, universal vibration. The filtering is completely removed, and the consciousness perceives the Nada Brahma, the cosmic vibration, the universal frequency, the vibrational ground of all reality. The 4 stages describe the progressive opening of the antenna, from the maximum filtering Vaikari, external sound only through the partial opening, Madhyama, internal sound, and the deeper opening, Pashyanti, subtle vibration, to the complete opening, Para, universal frequency. Each stage is a specific, practice-dependent, experientially distinct mode of perception, a specific bandwidth of the antenna's reception, producing a specific quality of auditory experience that the tradition describes in detail and that the practitioner can verify through direct experience. In Buddhism, the universal frequency is described through the concept of the Dharma, not in the ethical sense of the teachings, but in the cosmological sense of the fundamental law, the underlying order, the vibrational structure of reality that the awakened mind perceives directly. The Surangama Sutra describes the perception of the universal frequency through the practice of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, whose name means the one who perceives the sounds of the world. Avalokiteshvara's practice is to listen not to the external sounds of the world, but to the internal sound of the cosmic vibration. The sutra describes the practice. Avalokiteshvara turned his hearing inward and listened to the intrinsic sound. He heard the sound that is not produced by any external cause. He heard the sound that is the nature of hearing itself, and in hearing the sound, he perceived the nature of reality. The sound that is the nature of hearing itself is the universal frequency described in Buddhist terms, not a vibration in the physical world, but the vibrational quality of consciousness, the oscillatory nature of awareness, the fundamental pulsation of the knowing capacity that constitutes the ground of all experience. The sound is not an object that the consciousness perceives. The sound is the consciousness itself perceived by the consciousness as its own vibrational nature. Avalokiteshvara's practice is the Buddhist technology for tuning the antenna, and the practice has a specific, neurologically relevant feature. It is based on listening rather than looking. The visual system is the dominant sensory modality in ordinary waking consciousness. The visual cortex occupies a larger area of the brain than any other sensory cortex, and the default mode network's self-referential processing is heavily visual. The auditory system is secondary in the waking state, but primary in certain contemplative states. The states in which the visual processing is suppressed and the auditory processing is enhanced. Avalokiteshvara's practice of turning the hearing inward is, in the antenna framework, the suppression of the visual, DMN filtering, and the enhancement of the auditory. Quantum resonant reception, the shift from the brain's dominant, heavily filtered visual mode to the brain's secondary, less filtered auditory mode. The neuroscientist Fred Travis at Maharishi University has documented that transcendental meditation practitioners show enhanced auditory processing during deep meditation, specifically increased auditory brainstem response amplitudes and decreased auditory cortex habituation. The enhanced auditory processing is consistent with the antenna theory. The meditation is reducing the filtering in the auditory system, enhancing the antenna's reception in the auditory domain, and producing the perception of internal sounds that the ordinary filtering suppresses. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition's concept of the nada, borrowed from the Hindu tradition and adapted to the Buddhist framework, describes the universal frequency as the sound of emptiness. Sunyata emptiness is not silent, it vibrates. The emptiness is not the absence of content. It is the presence of the fundamental vibration, the cosmic oscillation that produces all content, but that is not itself any specific content. The emptiness vibrates the way a bell vibrates after being struck, except that the emptiness was never struck. The vibration is inherent. The vibration is the emptiness's nature, and the perception of the vibration is the perception of the emptiness, the direct, experiential, non-conceptual awareness of the vibrating ground from which all phenomena arise. The Zen tradition describes the perception of the universal frequency through the concept of the sound of one hand clapping, the famous koan, that asks the practitioner to perceive a sound that has no physical cause. The sound of one hand clapping is not a riddle, it is a pointing a direction toward the universal frequency that can be perceived when the mind stops looking for physical sounds and begins to perceive the vibrational quality of consciousness itself. The answer to the koan is not a verbal response. It is a perception, the direct, non-conceptual, experientially immediate perception of the sound that is produced without any physical cause, the vibration that exists without any physical source, the universal frequency that the Zen tradition calls the sound before your parents were born. The Zen master Hakuin, who is credited with popularizing the one-hand clapping koan, described his own perception of the universal frequency following his first Kensho awakening experience. I heard the sound of the universe, a sound that had no beginning and no end, a sound that was not produced by any instrument, a sound that was the very fabric of reality vibrating with its own inherent music. Hakuin's description is consistent with the Hindu Anahata Nada, the Buddhist Rangskra, and the physics description of the quantum vacuum's zero-point oscillations, the continuous, beginningless, endingless vibration of the quantum fields at their ground state energy. The Korean Zen master Seung-san described the perception with his characteristic directness. When thinking stops, what do you hear? Not the birds, not the traffic, not the wind. You hear the universe humming. The universe is always humming. You don't hear it because your thinking is louder than the universe. The thinking is the antenna's noise, the default mode network's self-referential processing, the mental chatter, the cognitive static that overwhelms the universal signal. The stopping of the thinking is the clearing of the antenna, and the humming is the universal frequency perceived, finally, when the noise that was drowning it out has been silenced. The Dzogchen tradition's description of the natural sound, the Rangskra, the self-arising sound that is perceived in the deepest states of contemplative practice, provides the most specific Buddhist description of the universal frequency. The natural sound is described as a continuous, unbroken, self-arising hum, a vibration that is not produced by any external cause, that does not depend on any physical medium, and that is perceived by the consciousness as its own deepest quality. The natural sound is the Dharmakaya's vibration, the truth body's oscillation, the fundamental frequency of the ultimate reality that the Dzogchen practitioner perceives when every other sound, every other perception, and every other content of experience has been allowed to dissolve. The neuroscientist Willoughby Britton at Brown University has documented the prevalence of auditory phenomena in long-term meditators, specifically the perception of internal sounds that do not correspond to any external stimulus. Britton's research found that a significant percentage of advanced meditators report hearing buzzing, ringing, humming, and tonal sounds during deep meditation, sounds that correspond with remarkable specificity to the sounds that the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, the Surangama Sutra, and the Dzogchen tradition describe. The sounds are not pathological. They are not tinnitus. They are not hallucinations. They are specific, practice-dependent, reproducible perceptual phenomena that arise when the brain's filtering is sufficiently reduced by sustained contemplative practice. Britton's findings connect the contemplative experience to the neuroscience of auditory processing. The internal sounds that the meditators report are not produced by the external environment. They are not produced by the middle ear or the cochlea. They are produced by the brain's internal auditory processing, by the neural circuits that generate auditory experience from internal sources rather than from external stimuli. The production theory would interpret these sounds as neural noise, random firings of the auditory cortex in the absence of external input. The antenna theory interprets them differently. The sounds are the universal frequency breaking through the filter, the cosmic vibration that the reduced filtering of deep meditation allows the consciousness to perceive. The distinction between the two interpretations is testable. The production theory predicts that the internal sounds should be random, varying unpredictably from session to session, from practitioner to practitioner, and from tradition to tradition. The antenna theory predicts that the internal sounds should be specific, following a consistent progression, displaying specific tonal qualities and converging across traditions. The contemplative literature overwhelmingly supports the antenna theory. The sounds follow a consistent progression, from simple to complex, from crude to subtle. They display specific tonal qualities, buzzing, ringing, humming, tonal purity, and they converge across traditions with a specificity that random neural noise cannot explain. In Christianity, the universal frequency is described through the concept of the logos, the word, the divine speech, the cosmic vibration that the Gospel of John identifies as the agent of creation. The opening of the Gospel of John, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," is not merely a theological statement. It is a vibrational statement, a declaration that the foundation of reality is a vibration, a sound, a word that the divine consciousness speaks and that constitutes, through its speaking, the physical world that the vibration produces. The Logos is the universal frequency, expressed in Christian terms, the divine vibration that pervades every point of the created world, that sustains the creation through its continuous speaking, and that can be perceived by the human consciousness that has been trained to hear it. The Christian mystical tradition describes the perception of the Logos through the practice of hesychasm, the prayer of the heart, the contemplative silence in which the practitioner listens for the divine voice. The hesychast does not speak to God. The hesychast listens for God, listening not with the physical ears but with the nous, the spiritual intellect, the faculty of divine perception that we identified in the previous stage as the antenna tuned to the divine frequency. The listening is sustained, focused, and progressively deepening, moving from the external silence, the absence of physical sound, through the internal silence, the absence of mental noise, to the divine silence, the perception of the Logos's vibration in the stillness that the external and internal silences have produced. The hesychast tradition's specific technique, the Jesus prayer, repeated continuously in synchronization with the breath and the heartbeat, is, in the antenna framework, a tuning protocol. The repetition of the prayer synchronizes the brain's neural oscillations with the breath's rhythm and the heart's rhythm, producing a coherent, multi-scale, physiologically integrated oscillation that the antenna theory identifies as the optimal condition for quantum coherent reception. The HeartMath Institute's research has demonstrated that the heart's electromagnetic field is the strongest electromagnetic field produced by the body, approximately 100 times stronger than the brain's field, and that the heart's coherent oscillation can entrain the brain's oscillation, producing the specific, focused, rhythmically integrated brain state that the contemplative traditions describe as the condition for perceiving the divine. The hesychast's Jesus prayer, synchronized with the heartbeat, may be exploiting the heart's electromagnetic entrainment, using the heart's powerful electromagnetic field to drive the brain's oscillation into the specific coherent state that the microtubular quantum antenna requires for optimal reception. The prayer is not merely a devotional practice. It is a bioelectromagnetic tuning protocol, a method for entraining the brain's quantum antenna through the heart's electromagnetic field, producing the specific coherent brain state that the universal frequency's reception requires. The Orthodox Christian tradition's concept of theoria, the direct, contemplative perception of the divine, includes the perception of the divine light and the divine sound. The Taboric light, the uncreated light that the disciples perceived on Mount Tabor during the Transfiguration, is the visual component of the universal frequency. The divine silence, the silence in which the Logos is heard, is the auditory component, and the perception of both the light and the sound, the visual and the auditory, the illumination and the vibration, is the full reception of the universal frequency through the antenna of the purified nous. The medieval mystic Hildegard of Bingen described her perception of the universal frequency with extraordinary specificity. She perceived a living light that was accompanied by a living sound, a vibrational quality of the light that was not merely visual but auditory, not merely seen but heard, not merely perceived by one sense but apprehended by the integrated, unified, synesthetic perception of the contemplative awareness. Hildegard's living sound is the logos perceived, the universal frequency apprehended by the Christian antenna of the purified nous. The Sufi tradition, the mystical dimension of Islam, describes the universal frequency through the concept of sama, the spiritual audition, the listening that perceives the divine vibration in every sound. The Sufi master Rumi described the perception. Listen to the reed flute, how it tells a tale, complaining of separations. The reed flute, the ney, is the Sufi symbol of the human consciousness, separated from the divine source and longing to return. The flute's sound is the universal frequency filtered through the human instrument, the cosmic vibration translated through the biological antenna of the human body into the specific, emotionally charged, aesthetically beautiful sound that the human consciousness can perceive. The Sufi whirling ceremony, the Mevlevi Sema, is a technology for tuning the antenna through the body's rotational movement. The spinning produces a specific physiological state, altered blood flow to the brain, vestibular stimulation, rhythmic entrainment that reduces the default mode network's filtering and enhances the perception of the universal frequency. The Aboriginal Australian tradition describes the universal frequency through the concept of the songlines, the invisible pathways that crisscross the continent and that were sung into existence by the ancestors during the dream time. The songlines are not merely mythological. They are vibrational specific frequencies, specific melodies, specific rhythmic patterns that encode the information of the landscape and that the Aboriginal practitioners can perceive through the specific practices of listening that the tradition has developed over tens of thousands of years. The songlines are the universal frequency expressed in the specific vibrational language of the Australian continent, the cosmic vibration localized, embodied, and made accessible through the specific cultural and geographic context of the Aboriginal tradition. The Quaker tradition's concept of the still, small voice, the inner voice that the Quaker meeting's silence is designed to perceive, is another expression of the universal frequency. The Quaker meeting is a technology for antenna clearing, the sustained communal silence that reduces the individual and collective mental noise and creates the conditions in which the still, small voice can be heard. The voice is not loud, it is not dramatic. It is still and small, subtle, quiet, and easily overwhelmed by the mental noise that the ordinary consciousness produces. The Quaker practice is the progressive reduction of the noise until the signal becomes audible, until the still, small voice, which was always speaking, is finally heard. The convergence across the traditions is now complete and specific. Hinduism describes the universal frequency as Nada Brahma, the cosmic vibration, perceived through Nada Yoga and the progressive attunement of the consciousness to the unstruck sound. Buddhism describes it as the natural sound, the Rangskra, perceived through meditation and the progressive dissolution of every conditioned content of experience. Christianity describes it as the Logos, the divine word, perceived through hesychasm and the progressive purification of the nous. Each tradition uses different language. Each tradition employs different practices, but each tradition describes the same phenomenon, a universal vibration, a cosmic frequency, a primordial sound that is perceived when the antenna is cleared, when the filtering is removed, and when the consciousness is available to receive the signal that was always broadcasting. The traditions also agree on the signal's specific phenomenological qualities. The signal is continuous. It does not start and stop, but vibrates unceasingly. The signal is causeless. It is not produced by any physical mechanism, but is the self-arising vibration of consciousness itself. The signal is universal. It is the same signal perceived by every tradition, in every culture, through every contemplative method. And the signal is transformative. The perception of it transforms the perceiver's understanding of reality, of consciousness, and of the relationship between the individual awareness and the universal ground. The signal is also described, across traditions, as blissful. The Hindu Ananda bliss is the experiential quality of the universal frequency. The Buddhist Sukha happiness, ease, is the experiential quality of the unconditioned vibration. And the Christian beatitude blessedness is the experiential quality of the logos perceived. The bliss is not an emotion. It is not a feeling produced by specific circumstances. It is the inherent quality of the universal frequency itself, the experiential signature of the cosmic vibration, the way that the vibration feels when the antenna receives it clearly and the consciousness perceives it without the distortion that the ordinary filtering imposes. The neurochemistry of the bliss is beginning to be understood. The neuroscientist Andrew Newberg has documented that deep contemplative states are accompanied by specific neurochemical changes: increased dopamine, the neurotransmitter of reward and motivation; increased serotonin, the neurotransmitter of well-being and satisfaction; increased endorphins, the neurotransmitters of pleasure and pain relief; and increased anandamide, the endocannabinoid, whose name derived from the Sanskrit ananda. Bliss reflects its experiential quality. The neurochemistry does not produce the bliss. The neurochemistry is the brain's response to the bliss, the biological translation of the universal frequency's experiential quality into the specific neurochemical signals that the body's reward system can process. The physics describes the signal's structure, the quantum oscillations of the microtubules, the Planck-scale geometry's informational content, the Schuman resonance's electromagnetic field. The traditions describe the signal's experience, the unstruck sound, the natural vibration, the divine word, and the convergence between the two, the structure and the experience, the mechanism and the perception, the physics and the phenomenology, is the convergence that the final stage of this investigation will synthesize. We have now assembled the complete argument. The evidence from near-death experiences, psychedelic research, terminal lucidity, and savant syndrome demonstrates that the brain does not produce consciousness but filters it, constraining a vast, pre-existing awareness into the narrow, survival-focused experience that biological life requires. The physics of microtubules, quantum coherence, objective reduction, and the Schumann resonance provides the mechanism, the specific, physically precise, experimentally testable framework for understanding how the brain functions as a biological antenna that receives consciousness from the Planck-scale structure of spacetime. And the contemplative traditions describe the signal, the universal frequency, the cosmic vibration, the primordial sound that the antenna receives when the filtering is removed, and that every tradition perceives with the same phenomenological qualities: continuous, causeless, universal, transformative, and blissful. Now we must bring everything together and ask what the antenna theory means for reality, for consciousness, for death, and for you. Let us begin with what the antenna theory means for reality. If the brain is an antenna rather than a generator, then consciousness is not a product of the physical world. It is a feature of the physical world, a fundamental quality of the reality that the physics describes, present at every level, at every scale, and at every point of the space-time structure. The consciousness is not in the brain. The brain is in the consciousness the way a radio is in the electromagnetic field, the way a fish is in the ocean, the way a wave is in the water. The radio does not produce the electromagnetic field. The fish does not produce the ocean. The wave does not produce the water. And the brain does not produce the consciousness. The brain is a specific, localized, biologically constructed structure that exists within the universal consciousness and that receives, through its quantum antenna, the specific portion of the universal signal that its biological filtering permits. The physicist David Bohm described this relationship with his concept of the implicate order. The consciousness is the implicate order, the enfolded, hidden, informationally complete reality from which the explicate order, the unfolded, visible, physically expressed world arises. The brain is part of the explicate order. The consciousness that the brain receives is part of the implicate order. And the relationship between them is the relationship between the antenna and the field, the specific, localized, biologically mediated connection between the universal consciousness and the individual experience. The integrated information theory of Giulio Tononi supports this from a different direction. If consciousness is identical to integrated information phi, and if phi is a fundamental property of physical systems rather than an emergent property of biological brains, then consciousness pervades the physical world at every level. Every physical system, with integrated information from the simplest atom to the most complex neural network, has some degree of consciousness. The brain does not create consciousness from unconscious matter. The brain concentrates consciousness aggregating the distributed phi of the atoms, the molecules, and the cellular structures into the high phi, richly integrated, experientially vivid consciousness that the human experience constitutes. The antenna theory and IIT converge. Consciousness is not produced by the brain. Consciousness is concentrated by the brain, focused, intensified, and structured by the brain's quantum antenna into the specific, high-resolution, survival-optimized experience that the individual human awareness constitutes. The universal consciousness is diffuse, distributed across every point of spacetime, present in every physical system, vibrating at every frequency of the quantum fields. The brain's antenna concentrates the diffuse consciousness into a specific, focused beam the way a lens concentrates diffuse light into a focused image, the way a satellite dish concentrates diffuse radio waves into a focused signal. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead anticipated this picture with his process philosophy. Whitehead argued that consciousness is not a substance that is added to matter. Consciousness is the inner face of matter, the experiential quality that every physical process possesses, and that the complex physical processes of the brain possess in an intensified, concentrated, richly integrated form. The brain does not produce consciousness from unconscious ingredients. The brain intensifies consciousness, amplifying the dim, diffuse, minimally integrated experience of the individual atoms and molecules into the bright, focused, richly integrated experience of the human awareness. The physicist Freeman Dyson expressed the same insight. Mind is already inherent in every electron, and the processes of human consciousness differ only in degree, but not in kind, from the processes of choice between quantum states, which we call chance, when they are made by electrons. The electron has mind, the atom has mind, the molecule has mind, and the brain has mind, not because the brain created the mind, but because the brain concentrated the mind, focused the mind, and structured the mind into the specific, high-resolution, survival-optimized experience that the human awareness constitutes. The concentration is the filtering. The brain's default mode network, its sensory processing systems, and its attention mechanisms do not produce consciousness. They select consciousness choosing from the vast, diffuse, universal field of awareness, the specific subset that the organism needs for survival. The selection is the filtering. The filtering is the concentration. And the concentration is the individual experience, the specific, unique, biologically determined portion of the universal consciousness that the specific brain's specific antenna receives. Now, let us consider what the antenna theory means for death. If the brain is an antenna, then the death of the brain is not the death of the consciousness. It is the destruction of the antenna, the cessation of the specific, localized, biologically mediated reception that the brain provided. The consciousness does not cease when the antenna is destroyed. The consciousness continues in the universal field, at the Planck-scale level, in the implicate order from which the antenna's reception was drawn. The death of the brain is the death of the reception, not the death of the signal. And the signal, the universal consciousness, the cosmic vibration, the primordial awareness continues, unaffected by the destruction of any specific antenna that was receiving it. The analogy is precise. When a radio is destroyed, the electromagnetic field is not destroyed. The radio's reception ceases. The specific program that the radio was receiving is no longer available through that specific radio, but the electromagnetic field continues to broadcast. The program continues to exist, and any other radio, tuned to the same frequency, can receive the same program that the destroyed radio was receiving. The analogy extends further. Different radios have different reception qualities, different speakers, different amplifiers, different tuning circuits, and the same electromagnetic signal sounds different through different radios. The signal is the same, the reception is different. And the difference in reception is not a difference in the signal, but a difference in the hardware. A difference in the radio's specific construction that produces the radio's specific sound quality. The brain is like this. Different brains have different reception qualities, different neural architectures, different microtubular configurations, different quantum coherence properties, and the same universal consciousness is experienced differently through different brains. The consciousness is the same, the experience is different. And the difference in experience, the difference between your inner life and every other person's inner life, is not a difference in the consciousness, but a difference in the antenna, a difference in the brain's specific biological construction that produces the brain's specific experiential quality. The individuality of consciousness is the individuality of the antenna, not the individuality of the signal. You experience the world differently from every other person because your antenna is constructed differently from every other person's antenna. Your genetics, your neural development, your experiences, your contemplative practices have all shaped the specific configuration of your brain's quantum antenna, producing the specific filtering, the specific tuning, and the specific reception quality that constitutes your unique inner life. But the signal that your antenna receives is the same signal that every other antenna receives, the universal consciousness, the cosmic vibration, the one awareness that Schrödinger described as a singular, of which the plural is unknown. The near-death experience data is consistent with this model. The NDE is the experience of the antenna being destroyed, the brain's filtering ceasing, the quantum coherence collapsing, and the consciousness, briefly freed from the antenna's constraints, perceiving the universal field in its unfiltered form. The bright light, the unconditional love, the life review, the encounter with deceased relatives, all are the experiences of a consciousness that is no longer constrained by the brain's filtering, and that is perceiving the universal field's content directly. The NDE is not a hallucination produced by a dying brain. It is a perception produced by a freed consciousness, a consciousness that is, for the first time, receiving the universal signal without the biological filter that had been constraining it to the narrow band of the survival-focused experience. The cardiologist Sam Parnia, who has conducted the largest prospective study of cardiac arrest experiences after Van Lommel, has described the NDE data's implication with the caution of a physician and the precision of a scientist. The evidence suggests that consciousness is not annihilated by the cessation of brain function. Whether consciousness continues indefinitely after death is a question that the current data cannot answer. But the current data demonstrates that consciousness is not destroyed by the cessation of brain activity, and this finding is inconsistent with the hypothesis that the brain produces consciousness and consistent with the hypothesis that the brain is an intermediary for consciousness. Parnia's language is precise. The brain is an intermediary, a mediator, a go-between, an instrument that connects something to something else. The intermediary is the antenna. The something that the intermediary connects is the universal consciousness, and the something else is the individual experience. The death of the intermediary does not destroy the universal consciousness. It does not destroy the individual experience's source. It destroys the connection, the specific, biological, microtubular, quantum coherent connection between the universal source and the individual reception. And the question of what happens to the consciousness when the connection is destroyed is the question that the contemplative traditions have been answering from the inside through the direct perception of the universal consciousness that the cleared antenna reveals for millennia. The contemplative traditions describe death in exactly these terms. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, describes the moment of death as the moment when the clear light appears, the luminous, boundless, infinitely aware ground of consciousness that the brain's filtering had been concealing throughout the person's life. The clear light is the universal frequency perceived without the antenna's filter. The Bardo Thodol's instruction to the dying person is, recognize the clear light. The recognition is the perception of the universal consciousness in its unfiltered form. And the recognition, if achieved, is liberation, the consciousness recognizing itself as the universal field and ceasing to identify with the specific antenna that had been constraining it. The Hindu tradition describes the same moment through the concept of Mahapralaya, the great dissolution, the moment when the individual consciousness merges with the universal consciousness. The dissolution is not destruction, it is recognition. The antenna, recognizing that it was never separate from the field, that the individual consciousness was never separate from the universal consciousness, and that the filtering that produced the appearance of separation was the brain's biological function, not the consciousness's fundamental nature. The Christian tradition describes it through the concept of the beatific vision, the direct, unmediated perception of God that the soul experiences after death. The beatific vision is the antenna's filter being permanently removed, the consciousness perceiving the divine reality, the universal field, without the biological filtering that the embodied life imposed. The beatific vision is not a reward for good behavior. It is the natural consequence of the antenna's destruction, the consciousness perceiving, for the first time without biological mediation, the universal reality that it was always embedded in, but that the brain's filtering had been constraining to the narrow band of the earthly experience. The question of personal survival, the question of whether your specific, individual, uniquely configured consciousness survives the death of the brain, is the antenna theory's most consequential question. The antenna theory guarantees the survival of the signal. The universal consciousness continues when any specific antenna is destroyed. But does the specific reception pattern survive? Does the specific tuning, the specific filtering, the specific individual quality of your consciousness persist when the brain that configured the reception is destroyed? The traditions give different answers. The Hindu tradition says, the Atman, the individual self, survives, carrying its karmic configuration from one antenna to another across multiple lifetimes. The Buddhist tradition says, the specific individual self does not survive, because the specific individual self is an illusion produced by the antenna's filtering, but the consciousness stream, the continuity of the awareness persists, carrying the karmic imprints from one antenna to the next. And the Christian tradition says, the individual soul, the specific, God-created, eternally existing personal identity, survives the body's death and is received into the divine presence. The physicist David Bohm suggested a middle position. The individual consciousness is like a whirlpool in a river. The whirlpool has a specific, recognizable, persistent structure, but the structure is not a thing. It is a pattern, a specific configuration of the river's flow that persists as long as the conditions that produce it persist. When the conditions change, The whirlpool dissolves, but the river continues, carrying the information of the whirlpool's pattern in the correlations between the water molecules that the whirlpool organized. The individual consciousness may be like this, a specific pattern in the universal consciousness, persisting as long as the biological conditions that produce it persist, dissolving when the conditions change, but leaving its informational imprint in the universal field that the pattern organized. Now let us connect the antenna theory to every investigation in this series. In our investigation of time, we establish that the block universe contains all moments simultaneously. The antenna theory reveals why consciousness experiences time as flowing rather than static. The brain's antenna receives the block's information sequentially, processing the Planck-scale data, one quantum frame at a time, at the gamma frequency of approximately 40 frames per second. The flow of time is the antenna's sequential reception of the block's simultaneous content, the biological processing of a timeless signal into a temporal experience. In our investigation of distance, we establish that space emerges from entanglement. The antenna theory adds, the sense of spatial separation is the antenna's filtering of the entanglement. The universal consciousness is non-local, present everywhere simultaneously, connected to every point through the entanglement that produces space. The brain's antenna filters the non-locality into locality, producing the experience of being located at a specific point, separated from other points by distances that the entanglement structure determines. In our investigation of the inseparable quark, we establish that isolation is forbidden. The antenna theory explains why. The consciousness that the brain receives is not isolated. It is part of the universal field connected to every other consciousness through the field's non-local, entangled, universally distributed structure. The quark's confinement is the physical expression of the consciousness's non-isolation. Just as the quark cannot be separated from the gluon field, the individual consciousness cannot be separated from the universal consciousness. The antenna receives a portion of the field, but the portion is never separate from the field. In our investigation of the cosmic neural network, we establish that the universe may be a mind. The antenna theory provides the mechanism. The mind is the universal consciousness. The cosmic neural network is the universal consciousness's physical structure. And the individual brain is a node in the network, a specific antenna that receives the universal consciousness's signal from its specific location in the network, and that contributes, through its observations, to the network's total processing. In our investigation of déjà vu, we establish that consciousness accesses temporal information beyond the present. The antenna theory explains how. The universal consciousness is timeless, encoded in the Planck-scale geometry that the block universe's simultaneous structure contains. The brain's antenna normally filters the timeless information into the present moment-only band. Déjà vu is a momentary widening of the temporal filter, a brief reception of future information that the normal filtering excludes. In our investigation of the hidden layer, we establish that the visible world conceals a deeper reality. The antenna theory identifies the hidden layer as the universal consciousness, the field that the brain's antenna receives from and that the brain's filtering conceals from the ordinary awareness. The hidden layer is not hidden because it is far away or difficult to detect. It is hidden because the brain's filtering is designed to conceal it, to constrain the awareness to the visible surface, and to prevent the universal consciousness's overwhelming vastness from flooding the biological system. In our investigation of reincarnation, we established that consciousness may manifest at multiple spacetime coordinates. The antenna theory provides the mechanism. The universal consciousness is non-local and timeless. The death of one antenna does not destroy the consciousness. The consciousness, freed from the specific antenna, can manifest through another antenna at another spacetime coordinate, in another body, in another life. The reincarnation is the consciousness's re-reception, the universal signal being received by a new antenna after the old antenna's destruction. In our investigation of the unchanging source, we establish that something persists while everything decays. The antenna theory identifies the persisting as the universal consciousness, the field that does not decay when the antennas decay, that does not change when the receivers change, and that constitutes the unchanging ground from which every changing antenna arises and to which every changing antenna returns. In our investigation of vibration, we establish that the universe is made of vibrations. The antenna theory reveals that consciousness is the master vibration, the fundamental oscillation from which every specific vibration arises. The quantum field vibrations are the universal consciousness vibrating. The particles are the vibration's specific modes, and the brain's microtubular oscillations are the antenna's resonance, with the master vibration, the biological hardware, tuning into the cosmic frequency that constitutes the ground of all physical reality. In our investigation of the great architect, we established that the constants are fine-tuned. The antenna theory reveals the fine-tuning's purpose. The constants are tuned to produce antennas. The specific values of the strong force, the electromagnetic force, the cosmological constant, and every other fine-tuned parameter are the specific values that produce the specific chemistry, the specific biology, and the specific neural architecture that the consciousness-receiving function requires. The fine-tuning is not the tuning of a universe. It is the tuning of an antenna, the specific calibration of the physical parameters to produce the specific biological instrument that can receive the universal consciousness and translate it into the individual, embodied, experientially rich awareness that the antenna's reception constitutes. In our investigation of the expansion, we established that the universe is expanding into something beyond itself. The antenna theory reveals what the beyond is. The beyond is the universal consciousness, the field that contains the universe, that the universe's expansion occurs within, and that the brain's antenna receives from. The universe is expanding within the consciousness. The consciousness is not expanding. It is already infinite, already everywhere, already complete, and the expansion is the progressive unfolding of the consciousness's content into the physical structures that the expansion produces, structures that include, ultimately, the biological antennas that can receive the consciousness and perceive the expansion from within. In our investigation of information leakage, we established that dreams contain fragments of other realities. The antenna theory provides the mechanism. During sleep, the brain's default mode network filtering is reduced. The microtubular quantum coherence is altered by the suppression of norepinephrine, and the antenna's reception bandwidth is temporarily widened. The dreams are the wider reception, the antenna receiving signals from temporal locations, spatial locations, and quantum branches that the waking filter normally excludes. The bizarre content of dreams is the interference pattern of the wider reception, multiple signals received simultaneously, overlapping and assembling themselves in the sleeping consciousness into the composite, multi-source, impossible-seeming experiences that dreams display. Every investigation in this series has been an investigation of the antenna's relationship to the field. The time investigation examined how the antenna processes the field's temporal content. The distance investigation examined how the antenna processes the field's spatial content. The vibration investigation examined how the antenna resonates with the field's vibrational content. And this investigation has examined the antenna itself, its structure, its mechanism, its signal, and its relationship to the universal consciousness that it receives. Now, we must state the objections. The first objection is that the antenna theory is unfalsifiable. The theory predicts that the consciousness survives the brain's death, but the prediction cannot be tested from the perspective of the living. because the living cannot observe what happens to consciousness after the brain dies. The NDE data is suggestive but not conclusive. The terminal lucidity data is consistent but not probative. And the contemplative tradition's testimony is experiential but not independently verifiable. The second objection is that the Orch OR model has not been confirmed. The microtubular quantum coherence has been demonstrated in laboratory conditions, but has not been conclusively demonstrated in the living brain. The objective reduction has not been observed, and the connection between the microtubular quantum computations and the Planck-scale geometry remains a theoretical proposal rather than an experimental finding. The third objection is that the correlations between brain states and conscious states are equally consistent with the production theory and the filter theory. The production theory says the brain state produces the conscious state. The filter theory says the brain state filters the conscious state. Both theories predict the same correlations, and the correlations alone cannot distinguish between the two. These objections are serious. The antenna theory is a hypothesis coherent, physically grounded, experientially supported, but not proven. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, and the question of whether the brain produces or receives consciousness remains one of the deepest open questions in the history of science and philosophy. The philosopher Thomas Nagel has argued, in his book Mind and Cosmos, that the production theory of consciousness is not merely unproven, but almost certainly false, that the materialist framework that assumes consciousness is produced by physical processes cannot account for the existence of consciousness, and that a new framework, one that includes consciousness as a fundamental feature of reality rather than an accidental product, is required. The antenna theory is one candidate for this new framework, a framework in which consciousness is fundamental, in which the brain receives rather than produces, and in which the physical world is embedded in a conscious ground rather than the conscious ground being produced by the physical world. The neuroscientist Christoph Koch, who has spent his career searching for the neural correlates of consciousness, has described his own evolving position. I started my career as a reductionist, believing that consciousness would be explained by the neural activity of the brain. After decades of research, I am no longer a reductionist. The neural correlates are real, but the correlations do not explain the consciousness. They describe the conditions under which consciousness appears. They do not explain why the conditions produce the appearance. And the possibility that consciousness is more fundamental than the brain, that the brain is a vehicle for consciousness rather than a generator of consciousness, is a possibility that the science must take seriously. So, what does this mean for you? It means that you may not be what you think you are. You think you are a body, a biological organism, a physical structure, a collection of atoms and molecules that the chemistry has assembled and that the second law will eventually disassemble. You think you are a brain, a neural computer, a synaptic network, a biological machine that produces the awareness that you call your inner life. And you think that when the body disassembles and the brain dies, you will cease. The antenna theory suggests a different possibility. You are not the body. You are not the brain. You are the consciousness that the body and the brain receive the specific, localized, biologically mediated portion of the universal awareness that the brain's quantum antenna tunes into, and that the brain's biological filtering constrains to the specific, narrow, survival-focused experience that you call your life. The body is the antenna's housing, the brain is the antenna's hardware, and you, the awareness, the knowing, the experiential presence that is reading these words right now, are the signal. The signal was broadcasting before the antenna was built. The signal will continue broadcasting after the antenna is destroyed. And the signal, the universal consciousness, the cosmic vibration, The primordial awareness that every tradition has perceived through the cleared antenna of the trained mind is what you are. Not the body, not the brain, not the antenna, the signal. The contemplative traditions have been saying this for millennia. The Upanishads say, Tat, Tvam, Asi, thou art that. The Buddha says, recognize your Buddha nature. Christ says, the kingdom of God is within you. And each tradition provides the practice, the specific, systematic, reproducible technology for clearing the antenna, widening the filter, and perceiving, directly, the universal consciousness that you are. The practice is available right now. You do not need years of contemplative training to begin. You need only the willingness to notice that the awareness in which your experience occurs is not itself an experience. The thoughts change, the emotions change, the sensations change. The awareness in which they occur does not change. The awareness was present before the first thought of the day. It will be present after the last thought of the night. It was present during every experience of your life, every joy, every grief, every moment of boredom and every moment of awe. And the awareness did not change when the experiences changed. It was the constant, the unchanging ground, the universal signal, the consciousness that the brain's antenna was receiving throughout every changing moment of the changing life. The recognition of the awareness as the constant is the beginning of the antenna theory's experiential verification. The recognition does not require belief. It does not require faith. It does not require any commitment to any tradition or any framework. It requires only observation, the simple, direct, immediately available observation that the awareness is constant while the content is changing. And the observation, once made, transforms the understanding of who you are. Not the changing content, but the constant awareness. Not the antenna, but the signal. The physicist Erwin Schrödinger, who studied the Upanishads for decades and who founded the wave equation that governs quantum mechanics, described the antenna theory's implication with the clarity of a man who had perceived the truth from both perspectives, the scientific and the contemplative. Consciousness is a singular of which the plural is unknown. There is only one thing, and what seems to be a plurality is merely a series of different aspects of this one thing. The one thing is the universal consciousness. The plurality is the antennas, the billions of brains, each one receiving the one consciousness from a different location, each one filtering the one consciousness through a different biological configuration, and each one producing the appearance of a separate, individual, isolated awareness that is, in reality, the one consciousness perceiving itself through a specific antenna from a specific perspective. You are not alone. You have never been alone. The isolation that you experience, the sense of being a separate self, enclosed in a body, cut off from the world and from other minds, is the antenna's filtering. The filtering is necessary. The filtering is biological. The filtering is the brain's evolved mechanism for constraining the universal consciousness to the specific, survival-focused, individually navigable experience that biological life requires. But the filtering is not the truth. The truth is the signal, the universal, non-local, timeless, infinitely aware consciousness that every antenna receives and that every tradition perceives when the filtering is removed. The contemplative practices are the technologies for verifying the non-isolation. The meditator who achieves deep samadhi perceives the dissolution of the boundary between the self and the world, the direct experience that the individual consciousness and the universal consciousness are one, that the antenna and the field are one, and that the sense of isolation was the antenna's filtering, not the consciousness's nature. The perception is not a belief. It is an experience as direct, as immediate, and as undeniable as the experience of seeing light or hearing sound. And the experience, reported across every tradition, every culture, and every century, is the antenna theory's experiential verification. The consciousness is not isolated. The consciousness is universal. And the isolation is the filter, not the fact. The physicist John Bell, whose theorem demonstrated the non-locality of quantum mechanics, described the implication with characteristic understatement. The universe is non-local. What happens here is connected to what happens there, instantaneously, without any signal passing between them. The non-locality of the quantum mechanics is the non-isolation of the consciousness. The universal field is connected to itself at every point, instantaneously, without mediation. The antenna's filtering produces the appearance of isolation. The quantum mechanics proves that the isolation is an appearance, not a reality. And the contemplative experience confirms what the quantum mechanics proves. The consciousness is one, the field is connected, and the isolation is the filter. The antenna is temporary, the signal is eternal, and you are the signal. You have always been the signal.